instance, Virginia, 40% of the white male tenant farmers, landless, they didn't own slaves, they didn't own land, 40% of the population, 1930s, 40% of the population is still landless tenant farmers, 2/3 are white and 2/3 are in the South. And that's one of the things I always like to remind people. When we think of social mobility, that comes with a commercial society, not an agrarian society. And in fact, at the time of the revolution, there was more upward mobility in Great Britain than there was in the New World, because we were more agrarian-based. But what Frank was talking about is this idea of upscale rednecks. And this is kind of, I think, one of the interesting issues about class identity in the United States. One of the things I talk about when we think about the 1950s, 1960s, and even into the 70s, part of class identity is that you want to blend in. And this is particularly true if we think about the 50s, that you were supposed to, move to the suburbs, you were supposed to somehow become an American by, a new geography, a new place that you lived. And there was this compelling need to, in this affect ethnic identity, to, learn to speak in a proper way, learn to assimilate. And the same is actually true, which is strange, but the same is actually true for how white trash imagine themselves, that they also did not want any connection to their past, that they also did not want to even acknowledge, or even, you'd think they would be the ones with, wanting to provide charity, wanting to sort of help raise up people in a similar situation. But no, because there's almost a penalty by associating what your roots are, where you come from. And I think this is still true today, because we still measure people by where they're born, by all the things that we associate with success in this country. So hiding your past as well as cutting off your past, I think, is one of the things that we often don't think about. We don't realize that just because you move into the middle class, that somehow you are the one who is going to be more generous to other people who are left behind. And that's one of the things I like to highlight. This is, I think, part of the problem with the Democratic Party. We can't just talk about saving the middle class. We have to realize if there's a middle class, there's also a lower class. And today, 42% of people living below the poverty line are white. So we can't just talk about the middle class. We have to sort of realize. And there's even, one of the things I talk about, there's even class tension between people who imagine themselves as white trash versus rednecks, or the term that is used by the sociologist Joan Williams is the idea of where she refers to the settled working class and then the hard living underclass.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I just hope that you're doing fine wherever you are today. This is your presenter Eugene Tech Stories, and I hope and glad that you're doing fine. So today's video is going to be a little bit an educative video, which is really important for the Black people and generally people who are the citizens of the United States of America. Now, The White Trash by Nancy Isenberg, a book which tries to unfold the truths of the United States. You're being told that the United States is a meritocracy country, that if you work hard, you're going to be receiving everything that you worked hard for. Now, did you know the history? Because the history of poor white people, and where did this class thing started from? It started by the white people themselves. They divided themselves as white people. We have indentured servants who are working in the farms with Black people. That's when we get to see where the classes started. And Nancy Isenberg has a thought-provocative title, which is The White Trash, the 400 years of untold history of class in the United States, in America. Now, the book challenges the myth of America as a classless society by delving into the history of the poor. The disenfranchising white people often refers to derogatorily white trash. Isenberg argues that class has always been the defining factor in American history, even though the nation's founding ideals promoted equality and opportunity for all. I want us to watch this video. It's really important. there is a part of American history that is untold that I want all of us to critically listen to what she says, critically listen to her perspective, and just see for yourself. Because most of us, if we say this, if you're just saying that, oh, you're always talking about this. Now, I want you to listen to the true untold history that most of us actually don't even know that existed. But you're glad, we are lucky that we are live at this point to get to see this kind of information. And why is this important? Because it is important because you're going to see the historical roots of, class division in the United States. Now you're asking yourself, where did the class division started? This is where I started. So join me in today's presentation as I am going to let the video play. As you always requesting, you're always saying that I don't need to interrupt the video. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna let the video play and just give you the relevance of why I think the video is really important, and it's so important even today as I'm speaking right to you today. Because the question of class, and the United States says that this is a classless society, that this is a meritocratic society, that if you work hard, you're going to be receiving everything you get, right? That's what has been told. And even if we try to look at different things, intersectionality between race and class, as amongst other topics that as a social science students we are being told, or we're being taught, race is something that the United States doesn't want to talk about because it's a meritocratic society. That's according to what you're being told. Whereas you're being told that that's a classist society, which is not true. Listen to Dr. Nancy Einsenberg, what she says about this. Then I'll be back with my commentary in regards to the same. I hope we all get to learn. And if you're watching this video for the first time, you know how we do as usual. Kindly like the video, share so that it can reach people who are like-minded like you. Subscribe to the channel. I don't have much to say. You can check my Patreon. You can join my membership. That's just a request. Well, let's dive right into the video.
What I'm struck by in your book is, first of all, the title, but then the way in which, in surveying American history, you really seize, as you do in the title, on language and how language has reflects our history, but also has shaped it. So just to get us started, could you tell us about the title and how you chose such a perfect title, and whether there was any debate in your publishing house whether this would be the title?
There was.
Okay.
One of the things I wanted to do with this book is show that our notions of class have a much longer and older history. And I take it all the way back to the British colonial period, in part because even though we tell ourselves that the American Revolution, we left Great Britain, we got rid of the aristocracy, in fact, none of that is true. We borrowed a great deal from British and English culture. And two of the concepts that are sort of central to where white trash comes from is, first of all, since we have been an agrarian nation for over half our history, it's important to pay attention to rural ways of thinking about class. And the idea of white trash actually was first used by Richard Hakluyt, who was an Elizabethan adventurer who made a pitch to Queen Elizabeth about why we needed the New World. And the real reason that he felt the New World was important is that it was going to be the trash bin for the poor and the idle and the worthless people in England. Now, this, of course, upsets the apple cart on the idea that somehow everyone who came to the New World were seeking religious liberty. It's not true. Most people were coming for economic reasons, and the word that was used by Richard Hakluyt to describe these people was waste people. So therefore, the idea of trash, Thomas Jefferson, Abigail Adams referred to the rural white population as rubbish. Now, we still hear that. British people still use that term today. But part of what I was trying to uncover is that two big concepts that we need to think about still shape our class system today. One is the idea of land. and the importance of the civic value and the economic value and the class value of being a landowner. And this is important because one of the things that we have to realize is that even in the early founding period, you couldn't vote unless you owned land, and land, in a sense, was seen as the real source of liberty. You had to be a landowner. So land, and if we think about why land continued to be associated with the poor were very much fashioned as either being seen as people who lived on land that was considered wasteland, because that's where waste people came from. Wasteland is land that's left untilled and fallow and is unproductive. So therefore, the waste people throughout American history end up being associated with unproductive land. For example, the term redneck is identified as being associated with people who live in swamps. At the same time, hillbillies are associated with people who live in the hills and are seen as poor. So land that's unproductive is the source of one important definition for understanding class identity. The other important theme that I highlight, which we also inherited from the British, is the idea of breeding. And this is really important because this is the idea that one's class identity is passed from one generation to the next. This connects to pedigree, lineage, and the fact that for the British and for early Americans and Americans in general, one of the things that we don't pay attention to is that class is not just only about property ownership or the labor value of the job you have. It's also very much linked to breeding and even your children. Children were a measure of the class identity and class status of individuals, because the poor children were always seen as unhealthy, poorly clothed, poorly fed. And by the time the term white trash appears, which is in the 1820s, at that moment, poor whites and white trash are now being associated with two other rather disturbing terms for the poor, which were clay eaters and sandhillers. Sandhillers, again, they lived on worthless sand. Clay eaters is where they were seen as not even being white. They were seen as having the skin color, a yellowish tint to their skin color that was compared to parchment. And part of the reason they had this disease is it's pellagra, but in the 1820s, 1840s, no one identified this. This doesn't get identified until the early 20th century. So when we think about class, we have to return to the importance of breeding, inheritance, and this is also why, as I trace my history, the other important thing to think about, and this unfortunately is still part of our history today, the other group that the English despised were vagrants. So the poor, in a sense, are always associated with people who don't put down roots, who aren't property owners, who are seen as people who are always on the move, people who, and this is actually even used today as a rationale for dealing with the poor. You might all be familiar with Kevin Williamson. He wrote for the National Review. When he wrote a very hostile essay attacking Trump supporters, he not only attacked them for living in dying cities and towns, and also used another favorite trope, referred to their critique as a yelping dog. But then he went on to say that, well, if you're poor, all you have to do is pack your bags and move. And this is, this idea of mobility continues to be a part of white trash identity, because in the late 19th century, there were cracker carts, because cracker is another important term for poor whites. And if we think about trailer trash, that's a house on wheels. That's a home, that's a place you live that never gets the same, it's never really seen as a home, because it's seen as again, people who are on the move, people who are not real property owners. So if you can go away from tonight thinking about several things that continue to be a part of our class identity. One is the way it's passed from parent to child, and that's even true for sociologists. They have found in 2015 the most important predictor of being successful in this country is linked to the wealth and privilege that you get from not only your parents, but your ancestors. So lineage and this idea of inheritance is still very much a part of our class definition. The other is this idea of breeding. Breeding is not only the way we might think of it in a positive term as acquiring taste or skills. It also, for white trash, it was seen as an imposed identity, something you literally inherited, and that's why I have a great deal to say about the eugenics movement and how incredibly popular that was. Everyone subscribe to this ideology. Professors at Harvard, leading politicians like Teddy Roosevelt. As you know, the major institute for studying eugenics was in New York, was in Long Island. Charles Davenport was the head of that. So these three concepts, mobility, vagrancy, breeding, pedigree, land and property, I think still continue to be extremely important ways for how we sort and divide people, because class isn't just about the money you earn, it isn't just about your job and the status, it's also bodily. It's also seen as the way you appear, and that's why white trash were always seen as, you know, children who are barefoot, diseased, and that this is sort of the dark side of class that really did define this cultural pattern that gets reinvented as the terms get reinvented across history and time.
Well, so I'll come back to the fight you had with your publisher, or discussion you had with your publisher about the title. But Frank, I wanted to ask you to speak to this issue about mobility, the idea really that we have of America as a place of liberty and mobility. I mean, where what Nancy is saying is that the mobility is actually in many ways an illusion, and white trash is a term that coheres around mobility or lack thereof. So if you could speak about the illusions that we live under, really, in terms of the American dream itself, the idea of the American dream.
Right. Well, I think, you know, in this terrific book, I have to say, those who haven't read it should read it, because this is a part of history we were talking before coming on that just has been, it's one of several things in American history that have been neglected. I mean, we know certain stories have been neglected, you know, minority group stories until recently and so on, but this cuts right across from the earliest settlements to the present day, and also another thing in the book that's fascinating is how it's also rooted in pop culture. Throughout, you know, Tobacco Road to the Beverly Hillbillies and everything in between. Yes, of course, this idea of complete freedom is an illusion, and it's something that politicians in particular like to sell. And you know, and really, probably it's Janis Joplin who had it right. I mean, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose, but still. It was Chris Christopherson. That's right. Yeah. Chris Christopherson wrote it, right? She sang it. And he wrote. She sang it, but he wrote it. And so a lot of this is completely, you know, rooted in our creation as a country and remains that way. And indeed, the Kevin Williamson piece is one of several pieces by conservatives, including, I would argue, Hillbilly Elegy, that memoir. Charles Murray, the conservative scholar, they all basically say, why can't you be like me and get up and go?
Right.
You know, and Williamson, rent a U-Haul and just leave. Right. You know, and so even people who are politically sympathetic in a way to how current lower class or working class whites vote still think, what's wrong with you? Freedom is there, it's there to be taken, and it has nothing to do. There's nothing stopping you, not the issues of pedigree and all the issues you discuss in this book that have been there from the beginning. It's just everyone has this opportunity. And then, of course, the political, this is beyond the purview of what we're discussing about. But then, of course, somewhat ironically, I guess, a lot of people who are stuck in these, in this economic plight and don't have the freedom of complete mobility, then assume that immigrants are somehow getting everything they're not. By the way, and another theme that's in the book that I'd like to hear you talk more about, Nancy, is you know that also people who do escape it historically then shut the door on those behind them and just assume, why can't it, and this goes back to a whole generation that was helped by the New Deal, helped during the Depression, as you describe, and then turn against the safety net and shut the door to that freedom.
Right. Yeah, two things. I mean, if we think for example, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, you've all heard of them. Their argument was not actually about promising mobility up the class ladder. What they claimed was going to change the class structure was the size of the continent. And what they promised was horizontal mobility, not upward mobility. But even Franklin, in a sense, was kind of as harsh as Kevin Williamson. Basically, he believed that if the poor were drawn into the West, that the ones who would succeed, who worked hard, had large families, that they, in a sense, would not only succeed, but that if they didn't succeed, he basically said, well, your option was to move on or die. And that's the thing I always like to remind people how the British thought about the poor. The British said that in the colonial period, there were 4 options about what would happen to the poor. First of all, they would die from starvation or disease. Second of all, they would be arrested and end up dying on the gallows or be executed. Third of all, they'd be sent off to fight wars and die there. And then fourth of all, they were going to be sent to the New World, and it was also expected that they would die there. And most of the early indentured servants who were sent to the New World were children, which is another thing I like to highlight. We forget that we had child labor into this country until 1919. And this was true across the board. This was in the South and in the North about exploiting child labor. And that also is why indentured servants, because of breeding, influenced the introduction of slavery into the New World. So those two things are intimately interconnected. But what Rich was saying, and one other thing about to prove how mobility really didn't happen. In 1776, in Thomas Jefferson's Virginia, 40% of the white male tenant farmers, landless, they didn't own slaves, they didn't own land, 40% of the population, 1930s, 40% of the population is still landless tenant farmers, 2/3 are white and 2/3 are in the South. And that's one of the things I always like to remind people. When we think of social mobility, that comes with a commercial society, not an agrarian society. And in fact, at the time of the Revolution, there was more upward mobility in Great Britain than there was in the New World, because we were more agrarian-based. But what Frank was talking about is this idea of upscale rednecks. And this is kind of, I think, one of the interesting issues about class identity in the United States. One of the things I talk about when we think about the 1950s, 1960s, and even into the 70s, part of class identity is that you want to blend in. And this is particularly true if we think about the 50s, that you were supposed to, move to the suburbs, you were supposed to somehow become an American by, a new geography, a new place that you lived. And there was this compelling need to, and this affect ethnic identity, to learn to speak in a proper way, learn to assimilate. And the same is actually true, which is strange, but the same is actually true for how white trash imagine themselves, that they also did not want any connection to their past, that they also did not want to even acknowledge, or even, you'd think they would be the ones with, wanting to provide charity, wanting to sort of help raise up people in a similar situation. But no, because there's almost a penalty by associating what your roots are, where you come from. And I think this is still true today, because we still measure people by where they're born, by all the things that we associate with success in this country. So hiding your past, as well as cutting off your past, I think is one of the things that we often don't think about. We don't realize that just because you move into the middle class, that somehow you are the one who is going to be more generous to other people who are left behind. And that's one of the things I like to highlight. This is, I think, part of the problem with the Democratic Party. We can't just talk about saving the middle class. We have to realize if there's a middle class, there's also a lower class. And today, 42% of people living below the poverty line are white. So we can't just talk about the middle class. We have to sort of realize, and there's even, one of the things I talk about, there's even class tension between people who imagine themselves as white trash versus rednecks, or the term that is used by the sociologist Joan Williams is the idea of where she refers to the settled working class and then the hard living underclass. And I think that's really because there's a real tension there because even though the settled working class are really afraid that they're going to drop down, they don't have any sense of class security. So they want to distinguish themselves. So we kind of think, oh, it's just upper, middle, and lower class. Not true. And even in the 19th century, one of the leading Confederates and intellectuals of Southern class system had 6 different classes for how he described white people in the South. And this is the other thing I think we have to pay attention to. Stop sort of assuming that, there's just 3 classes and that somehow all we have to worry about is the middle class.
Well, and that there's fluidity among them. I mean, that you can rise from one to the other. But I think one of the things I'd like to talk about in terms of the last presidential election, I mean, is one, your book was published in the middle of the primary season, which was uncanny timing, perfect academic timing, no doubt planned many years in advance. But how do you see, and then Frank, how do you see some of these issues playing out in what for many was a surprising outcome? Because one of the questions I had as you're talking is that a kind of an embrace of self-reliance that you talk about seems to go against what others, I mean, and including some of the people that you're talking about, would define as their own self-interest. So why is there a kind of, hunkering down almost into, into either policies that have not succeeded in raising the lower class to the middle class or the middle class to the upper class? And then what is the effect of that embrace on our country today? I mean, under a Trump presidency, I hate to use that phrase. Yeah.
Well, I think, one of the things that came out in the campaign season, and this is again based on observations of sociologists and others, is there is a real tension when we think about, I mean, one of the critiques I have is we can't just talk about the working class as a single unified class either. And the election really played off a whole series of things that were seen as opposites and as being contested. And that is the idea that we have an urban and rural divide. We have the language of cosmopolitan versus provincial. We have the idea of privileged elites versus how many people who imagine themselves as both upscale rednecks and white trash who would see themselves as the disinherited. And that to me was a very revealing concept because that again got me back to the idea of land. And it also gets into why there's so much resentment against immigrants, against groups that they see who are somehow being given handouts or privileges from the federal government that somehow is taking away from them. And they see that the latter has been rigged and that somehow they can't compete because the government is somehow favoring these groups. But this is part of the problem of our history. We never seem to acknowledge that the government has helped all sorts of people. I always, go back to World War II and the GI Bill, which my father benefited from, and no one sort of saw that as necessarily an undeserving welfare. And even today, what is so interesting about working class and poor rural Americans is that they prefer to get disability than welfare. Because disability, and these people have serious injuries because they're doing really demanding, difficult, and physically, the kinds of jobs that do lead to serious physical problems. But there's the question of honor and reputation and this problem of where do we get our identity from? If you imagine that your identity comes, as many poor rural Americans, it comes from your family, it comes from your community, you're not just going to pack your bags and move because that's kind of been the source of who you are. So the idea that individualism, that every individual should just go off and make a living, doesn't take into account the way in which people in rural America actually live and what they value. And I think that's one of the things we have to think about, because I think that one of the things that the election raised is this: we have to have a debate in this country, and we're already having a debate about the relationship between how we measure what work means and civic virtue, and how those two things are connected.
Well, Frank, I mean, if you could take that idea and then connect it to a couple of issues that are of major concern now. I mean, one is healthcare. Why is you raised the question of disability as opposed to welfare, but why is healthcare in general not seen, this is too large a question, I don't mean why is it not seen as a right, but why is there not a connection between the honor of receiving a disability check as opposed to a welfare check connected to an idea that healthcare is a social welfare open to all of us, whether we're working or unemployed or poor or starving or rich. And how does that play out in the election?
Well, it's very complicated because you have to inject into it, understand that the politics, the amount of political propaganda that's out there. In the early days of the Tea Party movement, when people had placards saying, take government hands off my Medicare, shows there's a confusion about what's going on. One of the most interesting things in the Vance book is
this is Hillbilly Elegy.
Hillbilly Elegy. All right, so here's a guy who's very, very successful. He's now venture capitalist in Silicon Valley with Peter Thiel. He concedes, to his credit, candidly in the book, that he's a huge beneficiary of government aid. Pell Grants. He was in the Marines. He got a scholarship at State University in Ohio. He GI Bill, went to Yale. All of this, and yet cannot bring himself to say that the government should do any of this for the people he left behind in Ohio. And in fact, after the book became a bestseller, he announced he was going to go back to Ohio.
Running for office, I think.
I think it's eventually he's going to run for office as a Republican.
Right.
And what is he doing there? He's basically going to look for hedge fund investments there to maybe, kind of Trump sort of will help get 15 people jobs, So this whole split, and this is something we haven't talked about yet, race has a lot to do with it too, as well as immigrants, because this feeling that somehow other people who are getting government aid are the real trash, the real undeserving, the moochers, even as they're dependent on the government for things including health care. And of course, what's happening now is that Obamacare, whatever its flaws, did give a lot of people health care. And now, if it's taken away, which seems likely, or it collapses because of the sabotage being done on what exists by the Trump administration, they're definitely going to want it. So once they have it, they want it. People do like Medicare. They do like Medicaid. In some of the most blighted parts of the Rust Belt, where the drug epidemic is out of control, they benefited. It was under Obamacare that for the first time, drug clinics were opened up, and addiction treatment was started, in parts of Ohio and Pennsylvania, and so once they need it, they like it, and now we'll see it'll be interesting. The politics will be interesting if it's taken away, and these are mainly people who voted for Trump to the extent that they voted. So it's all. So I think race has a lot to do with it too. One of the interesting things about Vance's book, about Hillbilly Elegy, but also about the sociologist Arlie Hochschild did this book about Louisiana, Strangers in Their Own Land, where she spent 4 years basically with people around Baton Rouge who are lower class, white, vote against their own interests, vote for Bobby Jindal, who did everything he could to pollute the state and literally poison their own water and their own environment. She makes the point from the left, she's a liberal, and Vance makes the point from the right, none of these people are racist. So it has to be something else. Race has nothing to do with it. And it's a strain through your book historically. I think it's bogus in the present, but you can talk about it more in historically where that fits in.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that, again, going back into the past and talking about history, one of the things that we don't forget, we tend to forget, is that during the Civil War, there was class and race were a dominant part of the divisions between the North and the South. And in Reconstruction, for example, one of the things that happened is that Republicans and people in the Freedmen's Bureau, and what people often don't know, the Freedmen's Bureau was also provided aid for white refugees. So in certain areas like Tennessee, Missouri, poor whites received extensive aid from the federal government. But what we forget is that from the Republican point of view in Reconstruction, over and over again, every major journalist, and this is what's amazing, they all wrote articles in major newspapers, they all wrote books about how are we going to reconstruct the South. And one of their key arguments that they felt would be a measure of whether the South will be able to rebuild itself in the image of the North and establish a free labor, freedom of contract society, is they really believed that it was going to be a contest between the freed slave and poor whites about who was actually going to get an education, get a job, be able to support themselves. And what we don't realize is that many of these Northerners and Republicans felt that African Americans were making progress at a much faster rate and were being far more successful. And then if you look at of course, the hostile reaction and the way in which the Democratic Party at that time used race quite effectively to attack the Republican Party. And when they went after the Republican Party and they looked at the politics in Reconstruction, they targeted 3 groups. And they used, and this is again, very specifically language that is disturbing to our ears, but the one we all know about are the carpetbaggers, because they were the people who came from the North and somehow were going to take over the South. 2 other groups I spent a great deal of time, and that is they focused on a term that they used over and over again, and that is the idea of mongrels. So they were obsessed with the idea of racial amalgamation, and and this becomes a dominant theme that the entire nation was going to collapse because there would be too much freedom, the fear of marriage between black and whites. This was going to lead to the downfall of not only the South, but the whole society. The other term, and this is one of my, again, to get you back to the vocabulary, a term to describe poor whites who supported the Republican Party. They were called scallywags. Now, what does that term mean? I spent a lot of time trying to figure this term out and where it came from. Yes, it was a way for elite whites and people who supported the Democratic Party to attack poor whites, and they saw them as a traitor to their race. They also described them as white trash scum. They referred to them because they were seen as Republican operatives. They associated too freely with blacks. But the word scallywag actually refers to an inferior breed of animal, particularly cattle. It's called vagabond stock. So there we have our vagrant theme again. We have our pedigree theme again. And they were seen as, the worst of the worst. And one of the leading redeemers referred to them, a very famous quote that even made it all the way to England, said that they were such, an inferior breed of Southerner that they were comparable to the meat that even dogs shouldn't eat. So, in fact, not only, and this, yes, I'm focusing on Southern politics, but even I have a whole section on the antebellum period where the racial issue and the pedigree issue dealt with the Mexican War, dealt with the racial, the arising of biological racism and how that plays into class. So there are moments when these concepts come together, when these concepts influence each other. But I also feel, and that's why one of my arguments today is that we have to look at race and class together. We have to sort of deal with both of these issues because they're really important in the way in which they can be used. They can also be used to divide poor whites and African Americans politically. And that was what the racist demagogues of the 1890s and the early 20th century, like James Vardaman, and he's the one who I think is most like Trump, because basically he said that democracy should be as dirty as the people are, and the people should get to say whatever they want. And he was also known for his long locks. But
what color?
Yes, they weren't orange. But I think this is why I say democracy, we have to sort of realize that much of what Trump is doing is borrowing from scripts from previous presidents, previous politicians, and the idea that politicians put on a show, that they entertain the audience, not just that they make empty promises, but that in Trump's case that he spoke in a way that people felt was more honest and more authentic, because even if he insulted people, somehow that's more honest than a politician who, will talk around an issue. And that's something that, again, scholars who look at class politics, working class politics today say it's very appealing. This idea of straight talk, this idea that you're not going to, even though he's feeding people a lie, they weren't doing a fact check. It was the way he spoke. It's the style in which he spoke that really, in a sense, was seen as somehow he's talking to them and not down at them. And that's the way in which many Trump supporters, like the Tea Party supporters, hate privileged elites who they associate with Washington insiders.
So do you think, speaking of the mongrel, it occurred to me while you were saying this, do you think that President Obama was even more an object of vitriol because he was a biracial man than he was simply because he was a black man? A suspicion of the infiltration of white America, the weakening of white America by, miscegenation.
Yeah, and that, who is it? The country singer, the one who's no, he's a hard rock country singer. The one who was just invited to the White House.
Ted Nugent.
Ted Nugent called Obama.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Really, there is a lot of things that we have learned or we really need to learn. And it gave me a perspective. And with me, I came with different key themes and, what she was trying to talk about. Trying to talk about the historical roots of class division as a talking point of what Dr. Nancy Insenberg tried to talk about. Remember, Insenberg traces the origins of class distincts in America back to colonial times. She explains how the British colonizers saw the New World as a place to dispose the waste of people. England, the poor criminals and vagrants, these early settlers, often white and impoverished, became the foundation for what we'll call later labeled as white trash. So white people, amongst themselves, they divided themselves. Poor white people down the caste, rich white people up the caste. Some were taken as criminals, vagrants, labeled as waste. That's why the title, The White Trash. And this shows you that if you're white and you don't have resources, you're being taken as a person who doesn't have anything in the society. So you become a white trash. Now that shows the historical roots of class division, which is really important part of American history that we need to know. That we need to know that this internal hate started amongst themselves. This internal division started amongst themselves. Now we are seeing this sprouting out now to black people, talking about things like racism. That's where the intersectionality comes with. That we are not just seeing people as class, we are also seeing people in regards to their races and the implication or what economic implication do they have towards these races, right? So understanding the historical part of the United States, it's really important, and understanding how it really operates. That's one of the major things that she talks about that I believe it's important. Now, the second thing that she talks about that I also believe that it's important for we black folks, so that we get to learn, we get to see where all these things started, right? So the second one is the myth of American dream. This is the biggest of all. We've been taught that if you work hard, you'll be rich, you'll go to school, you'll earn your degree, you'll get your job, and everything will just be cool and swift, So that's what we've been told, right? But it doesn't seem to happen like that, because that's the myth of the American dream that we have been sold to, right? Now, trying to understand what she talks about, she critically examines the American dream and how it has failed to include large segments of the population. While the nation promoted itself as a land of opportunity where hard work could lead to success, Eisenberg argues that poor whites were often excluded from this promise due to systemic inequality. Throughout the American history, social and economic mobility has been limited for many, especially poor white people. Listen, this is important. Today, East, West, South, North, people are complaining about the cooperatives and the cost of living in the United States. We have few white people who have, not few white people, but we have few people, majority white, who have kept these resources, and these are the corporate, who have kept these resources for themselves, or they own important factors of production that the mass group of people doesn't have, right? This means that they enjoy the monopoly, they control the prices of goods and services, and this shows how they control everything which happens. That's why today we are seeing even white people trying to get out there, complaining how the cost of living is hard for them, while we have few people who are enjoying life, or enjoying everything which is happening around them, right? So we get to see how things really come into play, and you understand the importance of just, the importance of how really people are being played. I'm not even talking about black people, the complaints that they have, which has also been part of this discussion, because we as black people, we need to understand where these problems started. This problem started with whites themselves, as they started putting the caste system in the United States. Now, the caste system itself sprouted now to what we call now, we have black people. They'll become so much powerful when we leave them to unite with black people, because we have indentured white people who worked in these farms, right? So when we have these people who worked in these farms with black people together, they saw to it, nah, we ain't going to leave these people unite, because they were becoming now the majority. The power of black people and white people together, now they were becoming the majority. And now when they were becoming the majority, now the elites, the few people who are of, the white class and name it all, they started seeing, okay, when they come together, they'll be powerful. Now what can we do? They saw to it, nah, we need to create division. And the division was the racial division. They divided white people and they divided black people. That's what they do, right? Now we started seeing this class sprouting out to race. And that's what they did. And that's how they achieved it. I'm also going to be talking about derogatory labels and class identity. Terms like white trash, crackers, hillbillies, and rednecks have long been used to stigmatize poor white people. Eisenberg explains how these labels reflect a long-standing prejudice and reinforce the notion that poverty is as a result of personal failing rather than structural conditions. This labeling of the poor inferior serves to maintain social hierarchies, and they achieved it. Explains why we have the title, the white trash title, right? Political and social manipulation. Eisenberg also explores how the existence of lower class of white people has been used politically. The elites throughout the American history, from the founding fathers of modern politicians, have manipulated poor whites. I'll pause a little. Elites throughout the American history, from founding fathers to modern politicians, have manipulated poor whites by exploiting their racial identity, by emphasizing their whiteness as a form of superiority over black people or other marginalized groups. Political leaders often diverted attention from the real issue of class inequality. Now they saw to it, nah, let's make these white people, let's give them a race. They've suffered for a long time. Now let them give them, these titles. Now you are white, they are black. You don't need to be together with them. Yet down the sea, they are still perpetuating the class, and they are enjoying looking back at things. Oh, black or white fights. Oh, they're not seeing class. They're seeing racism. They're not seeing class. That's what they're saying. And that's how everything has been happening. And that's how they have been always playing generally black people. And that's how it has always been happening. Now you get to see the real picture of everything, or how just everything do happen. Okay? She talks about the role of land and property. If you listened keenly, she talked about it. There's one thing that she says that I also want to emphasize on. Land ownership and access to property have always been markers of status in America. Eisenberg shows how poor white often exclude from this aspect of economic power. Many poor white were relegated to living in desirable areas as tenant farmers, limiting their abilities to advance economically. This explains a lot of things that probably we all need to understand. Really, really important aspect of the book explains a lot of things that we black folks need to understand. Cultural depiction of poor whites. The book also explores how poor white people have been portrayed in American culture. From literature to film, these depictions often reinforce negative stereotypes and served as a way to distance the middle and upper class from the white trash population. Really, really crazy, right? So, probably you are a person who want to check out the works that she's done. She's done notable works such as The White Trash. She's done notable works such as The Fallen Founders, The Life of Aaron Burr, which was written in the year 2007, Madison and Jefferson, of which she has also emphasized while she was in the video, which was co-authored with Andrew Batsay. In this book examines the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, offering insights into political philosophies and the foundation of the American democracy. So, if you're a person who's interested in purchasing her books, you can go and, definitely do that. It's really, really important. And Dr. Eisenberg wanted to expose the intersection between race and class. Yes, because the Allies used race card to confuse people. Yet, not focusing on the class, they're maintaining their social hierarchy while people are still fighting down here about race. That's how they maintained, and that's how they achieved this. So, this is your presenter, Eugene Duke Stories. As usual, those are my two observations. Those are my 2 cents that I wanted to, highlight from what I've learned from the video. And it's always good to share what you think. And I'll also ask you to tell me down in the comment section what you think about this video. Is it helpful to you? What do you think about it? Yeah, that's what we all need to know. We need to see the need or the cause root of all these problems and everything which is happening in our society. Until then, this is a presenter, Eugene Duke Stories. And if you're watching this video for the first time, I'll definitely ask you to subscribe to the channel, to join the membership, and check out my Patreon. Get to see what I can offer you. Until then, let's meet in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.